We are in the middle, friends, of the most sacred week in the Church's liturgical calendar. This week is known as Passion Week. It begins after celebrating the story of the raising of Lazarus, and it runs from Palm Sunday through Good Friday today and ends with Easter Sunday. It refers to the trials and sufferings that Jesus underwent before his death. When we studied the raising of Lazarus together, we noted that it was there just not only to demonstrate God's power, it was also a very helpful way to understand the meaning of the events of the week that followed. That powerful story sheds light on why this week is called Passion Week by the Church. Passion, we saw, comes from the Latin word to suffer, and it's the root of the word compassion, which means to suffer with someone or to come alongside them in their suffering. It surfaced a major theme that would play out during Passion Week, namely the pain of the world meeting the passion or the compassion of God. There, Jesus identified with the pain and suffering that death causes in our world and in our lives. And there, Jesus, we saw, was stirred in his heart and spirit to do something about it. Today's story reveals that Jesus does not only come alongside us or identify with our burdens and struggles alone. Here we see that Jesus takes the full weight of those burdens upon himself. Two great burdens weigh humanity down. First is the burden of sin. Running right down through the middle of each of us is a line between good and evil. And that root of evil manifests itself in various forms of revolt and rebellion against God. That devilish desire inside of us to go our own way causes our hearts to go bad and for us to take broken paths in life. Sin is a burden from whose weight we can never truly break free on our own. The other burden weighing us down is death. If God is the source of light and of life in our world, and sin is rebellion against God, then death is the consequence of sin, bringing darkness into our lives and into our world, and robbing us of God's love, God's light, and of God's very life. It too is a burden from whose weight we just can't seem to break free. Friends, events happening in our world remind us that there is a dark side to humanity. Sin and evil, death and darkness plague humanity all over our world. And those of us who've had the benefit of living in relative peace for a while can become naive to this dimension of our natures. But we have seen in recent weeks that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when the powers of darkness are unleashed in their hearts and all restraints on evil are lifted. Despite our objections and our feeling of offense, that fine line is there in each of us. So the events of Good Friday unmask us. Good Friday shows what happens when the evil in our hearts and the supernatural powers of darkness combine to unleash their worst on Jesus, the Son of God. A scene of immense horror unfolds. Nonetheless, in that horror, Jesus becomes our great burden bearer. As the prophet Isaiah foretold, our sins would be laid on him to make us whole. So, what are some of the burdens of humanity that we saw laid on Jesus? Well, in the burden of surrender, we saw that our situation is so dire that there's no other way for sin and death to be defeated. Jesus must let evil unleash its worst on him as it does on the rest of us to overcome its relentless power and defeat it. If you think about it, God could have ended it all right there and started afresh. But that would be the end for all of us and our world, and that would not be good news for us. Or God could tackle sin and death at its source, defeating them for us, thereby making it possible to restore us, to make us and the world whole again. And we see that Jesus accepts the harder path to help us. In the burden of accusation, we see the power of false narratives and lies. Friends, we see here that truth is as much under fire then as it is today. Here, lies and misinformation are the tools of evil and injustice. But we know this, that truth matters. When truth is sacrificed, death and darkness often ensue, and we see how false accusations, slander, and blatant lies foster injustice, violence, and even death. Jesus takes the burden of our deceit upon himself. And in the twin burdens of mockery and humiliation, we see what happens when we rob someone of their dignity and debase them. Jesus is stripped of that which rightly belongs to him, his human dignity as a person and his identity and honor as the Son of God. The royal crown, the royal robe, and the royal staff are all rightly his. But here they are used to mock him. He is mocked with the same. Yet in that he suffers the dishonor of all who have been robbed of their inheritance, who have been robbed of their identity, and have been robbed of their inherent self-worth. And if we think about what's happening in our world today, again, we can see that people of color and First Nations groups around the world know this reality all too well. Jesus takes the burden of indignity upon himself. We've got to pause there and think, what heavy burdens to carry, don't you think so? But friends, there's still more. There's still more. In the burden of rejection, we see the distorting power of sin. We, humanity, we need rescue. Humanity needs saving. And before them and before us is the one sent by God to save the world. Yet they wrongly perceive their rescuer as their enemy. Like a parasite killing its host, it makes absolutely no sense. No wonder Jesus prays for them and prays for us from the cross, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they have no clue as to what they are doing." We see that Jesus takes our warped thinking upon himself. And in the burden of loss, we see the awful consequences of death. Death robs us of the presence of the ones that we love, and faced with his death and impending departure from this world, Jesus makes arrangements for his mother's care. Like us, he has to think of the well-being of those who depend on us, those who remain behind when we are gone. It's a beautiful act by a son towards his mother, but still, friends, it reflects a sad reality. Death robs us relationally, but it can also impoverish the loved ones that we leave behind. Jesus takes the burden of loss and care on himself too. And then there's the burden of the cross itself. Nothing conveys the heaviness of our load more than the sight of Jesus stumbling under the weight of the cross. It's easy for us to think that it was manageable for him because he is the Son of God sent from heaven. But we have to remind ourselves that he is fully human like us. His agony was so great in the garden before this that drops of blood broke through his sweat as he prayed. And here the crushing weight of our sin causes him to stumble, but he keeps walking towards death. And then finally, there is the burden of death. Jesus enters into the dark experience of death. It is so dreadful that on that day the physical world mirrors the harrowing depths of death by being plunged into darkness at midday. And Jesus' cry of abandonment echoes the sense of abandonment we all feel as death approaches and seeks to snuff out the gift of life that God has given our bodies. Jesus takes on the depths of our distress in a very, very real way. Jesus, our great burden bearer. Good Friday, as we saw right at the beginning, is a horrific yet beautiful story of the pain of the world meeting the passion or the compassion of God. A God who weeps with us, a God who suffers with us, a God who sacrifices himself as a sin offering for us, and a God who takes on our burdens on himself to make us whole. And oddly, there is something different about this death. This horror actually brings hope. The story does not end on Good Friday. A flicker of light remains, as we see with this candle in that dark episode. It says this: Jesus gave up his own spirit. Friends, death could not take his life. It had no power over him. Rather, there on the cross, he surrendered his spirit, giving up his own life for us. For he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his wounds we are healed. For we all like sheep have sinned and gone astray, each and every single one of us to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. For he poured himself out to death and bore the sins of many.